Hello and welcome to today's lecture on John Locke's theory of natural rights. The main objectives of today's lecture are to understand the origin of natural rights as per John Locke, to understand what Locke meant by the right to life and liberty, to have a deep understanding of the right to property, to understand how Locke differed in his idea of natural rights from his predecessors, and to understand the implications of Locke's theory of natural rights. Born in 1632 in England, John Locke grew to become one of the most influential thinkers of modern political thought. Locke lived in a time of the tussle for supremacy between the king and the parliament after the end of English Civil War, and it was in this context he wrote his most eminent works. Given the ongoing political struggle, the general belief among the contemporaries of Locke was that Catholic monarchs promoted political absolutism. Also, the religious freedom of the dissenters of church was still harshly dealt with. Amidst this, Locke, being an ardent supporter of liberty, had been involved in events such as Exclusion Crisis, Monmouth Rebellion, and Rye House Plot to kill Charles II, for which he was eventually exiled to Europe. After attending Oxford University to study medicine and natural philosophy, Locke developed a close association with the first Earl of Shaftesbury. It is said that Shaftesbury had a deep influence on Locke, shaping him as a liberal thinker, especially with regards to his views on limits and responsibilities of government. Locke's important writings include Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Two Treatises of Government, and Letters Concerning Toleration. The True Treatise of Government contains Locke's most influential ideas, which include his idea of natural law, social contract, theory of natural rights, and limits of government. Two Treatises was written as a rebuttal to Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, popular in 1680s, as it defended the theory of divine right of kings. Filmer advocated and justified the political absolutism of monarchy as a paternalistic inheritance descended from Adam, the father of whole mankind. First part of the treatise being the critique of divine rights of king, the second treatise has more of a constructive purpose in developing a theory of legitimate responsible political authority based on consent. Also departing from Hobbes' natural law doctrine as articles of peace or counsels of prudence with the minimalist function of seeking peace for the sake of felicity, Locke believed that natural law contains the criterion of good and evil and regulates human behavior for not only to secure self-preservation but also the preservation of mankind. In Locke's state of nature, it is the natural law which operates and prevents it to turn into a state of license. It is from this natural law Locke derives his theory of natural rights, which will be discussed in this lecture. John Locke enumerates three natural inalienable rights, namely the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. Before delving into what Locke means by each of these rights, it is important to understand his explanation of the origin of these rights. Locke states in his two treatises that natural law is God's law, understandable by reason besides the divine law, which is contained in the religious scripture of New Testament. He considers natural rights as entitlement under natural law, and in the state of nature, it is under natural law that people are able to have their natural rights and respect the natural rights of others. According to Locke, God created man with a purpose to live and sustain as long as he wished. Adam and Eve lived in paradise with all the sustenance, without having to labor for it. It was only after the fall of Adam and the emergence of the sentiment of desire that men had to labor for their sustenance in this world, which was made available to him as a mercy from God. This meant that man had a natural right to labor and to the land which he tilled, and therefore to the produce it got. Locke thus constructs a very complex theory of natural rights, particularly the natural right to property, from this compelling explanation of origins that is solidly based on God's own world. It means God's law, whether it be written in the Ten Commandments, discovered via human reason, or any other form, implies a commensurate set of rights. And these rights, Locke says, are the right to life, liberty, and property. By right to life, Locke means that individual, by virtue of being the creation of God, has an inviolable right to life. God has created and meant that human beings live at his wish and not anybody else. This means that nobody has the right to kill or harm a person except in a situation of war, where it is a question of self-defense. Secondly, God has commanded man to labor and toil for his sustenance, so he has to have the right to liberty for the same. This encompasses the idea that individuals have the freedom to pursue their own goals, make choices, and act in their best interests without interference from others, and as long as they don't infringe upon the rights of others. Thirdly, as God commands man to labor, it naturally gives birth to man's right to property, as the land he mixes his labor with belongs to him, and so does its produce. Locke argues that as men are equipped with natural reason, they are easily able to recognize their rights. But besides the rights, it also makes them realize their corresponding duties towards others. Locke states that man can by reason acknowledge that other men are endowed with the same rights as him, and that all rights come with a set of corresponding duties. Enjoying rights essentially contains an element of reciprocity, which makes the state of nature livable and social. Besides, people are also expected to keep their promises and value trust amongst themselves. This makes Locke's state of nature social and moral in character. However, the state of nature, Locke says, is a place of deviant men too. Not everyone would respect the natural law as it ought to be. Besides, there is another natural right that men have, that is, the right to judgment and punishment, which they execute when natural law and natural rights are violated by fellow men. This right McClellan calls an energizing right. He says it is not a substantive right, rather it is a right which gives life to other natural rights. all rights are hollow if there is no right to adjudicate over the transgressions. But then the problems within the state of nature begin to appear as human beings progress socially as well as economically. The first inconvenience that people face in the state of nature is insecurity of peace, which is constantly disrupted by corrupt and degenerate men. In such a state, people feel the need of an established known law, a known and impartial judge, and an executive authority to ensure the enforcement of these laws and judgments. The economic advancement with the emergence of private property makes impartial adjudication a difficult task. Hence, it becomes important and prudent for men to exit the state of nature and enter into a social contract. This contract, we know, establishes the state. It is a contract of all with all, to which all the members of the society consent and agree to submit to the majority rule. It establishes a political authority to which men entrust some of their natural rights, like right to judgment and punishment, with the purpose and trust that this transfer of power to this authority would secure them their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Also, important is to note that with the making of this contract, the natural law does not cease to exist, as in Hobbes' case. The state is supposed to uphold the natural law as the natural rights flow from it, and in case it fails to do so, people have the right to resist or revolt, as the supreme power still remains with people. Lockean understanding of natural rights makes them an asset rather than a liability, as in the case of Hobbes. This becomes possible by restricting the natural rights in a way to make them retainable and manageable. They are inalienable gifts of God that men wish to keep and preserve rather than give up in the civil society. Thus, one can tell that men enter the political society with the expectation of enjoying their natural rights with security, and this is the primary purpose of the state. State comes into existence for this purpose, so it must be limited to this purpose only. Any state crossing its limits or infringing upon the natural rights immediately loses its right to govern. Now, let us examine each of the natural rights in detail. First, the right to life. According to Locke, right to life is a natural, inviolable right of every person which can neither be surrendered nor transferred to any entity. Being the creation of God, right to life is inherent to man and must be preserved vehemently. Locke says that the natural law commands not just self-preservation of man, but also the preservation of whole mankind. In this regard, right to life also rules out any attempt to suicide or murder. Locke emphasizes a moral side of it, besides considering it as a right. He considers it as a duty owed to God, a trust to be preserved. Right to life becomes synonymous with self-preservation, and Locke argues that in the state of nature, one has the right to do anything to preserve themselves within the bounds of natural law. One is also obligated to respect other people's right to life as long as it does not come into competition with one's own right to life. It is also an unalienable right of a person to safeguard his life against any arbitrary control of authority, which means people have the right to resist any kind of infringement or attempt to invade their right to life by an oppressive government. It is important to note that unlike Hobbes, Locke recognized that all natural rights, including right to life, extend to all persons equally, and that men have the capability to respect this endowment by nature. This means that their rights are constrained by the moral duty to not transgress the rights and lives of innocent people. The second is right to liberty. Right to liberty forms another fundamental natural right people are born with, according to Locke. It encompasses the idea that individuals have the freedom to pursue their own goals, make choices, and act in their best interests without interference from others. Natural right to liberty, as per Locke, is God's permission to men to act in the world in their best interest while respecting the same liberties of others. Locke makes a clear distinction between right to liberty and right to license. Man has the liberty to do anything as he pleases as long as it falls within the limits of natural law. The premise that all men are born equal with same natural rights and most men exercise their rights as per the natural law makes social life possible in the state of nature. It is only because of certain inconveniences that emerge with the progress of man that social contract is conceived for the constant purpose of preservation of natural rights of mankind. So this political authority is only obliged to restrict individual liberty when necessary to prevent harm to others. The formation of a government is done in order to enjoy maximum liberties with security. But right to liberty comes with some rational bindings. For instance, people cannot exercise their right to liberty to consent to slavery, just as they cannot consent to setting up of an absolutist sovereign, as Hobbes suggests. In his two treatises of government, Locke states that the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. The liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the commonwealth, nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but what that legislative shall enact according to the trust put in it. Locke further says that the purpose of the political authority is to preserve the freedom enjoyed by man under natural law in the state of nature. He writes, "Freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society and made by the legislative power erected in it, a liberty to follow my own will in all things where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature." This passage explains the significance of liberty in the eyes of Locke. In this regard, it is important to realize that people, while entering the contract, are making a rational decision. They are consenting to form an authority to watch over the execution and adjudication of natural law only when they are sure that they are gaining in this exchange. In lending the government some of their liberties, they believe that they will be able to enjoy their fundamental natural rights in a better way than they were able to do in the state of nature. The last right is the right to property. Locke's theory of property is one of the central elements of his philosophy, which had a huge impact on the development of liberalism. He argues that individuals have a natural right to acquire, possess, and dispose of property as an extension of their labor. Property rights are seen as essential for individuals to secure their well-being and pursue their happiness. But for the explanation of the same, it is essential to understand how the concept of private property first emerges in the state of nature, given that all resources of nature were given by God to mankind in common. Locke argues that God has made each person as the sole owner of his body and life, that is, his hands and legs are clearly one's own property. In Locke's words, every man has a property in his own person, and that the labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. It follows that the individual's physical or mental capability or the ability to labor belongs to him alone. Therefore, to begin with, men already have property in the form of their labor. Also, Locke says that just as through God's creation or workmanship we are the property of God, similarly, putting our labor into something makes it our property. According to Locke, if one's life and body are their own property, then the fruits of their labor with those bodies and lives should also rightfully be theirs. As a result, a labor theory of property is established, according to which an individual is the owner of anything they combine their labor with to create. Therefore, Locke contends that while uncultivated soil may be considered the common property of humanity, once someone works to develop it, the land rightfully becomes that person's private property. By doing so, Locke has provided support for a natural right to property in the state of nature without the requirement for a government to formally recognize property claims. Locke's right to property is subject to certain restrictions. The first restriction is that one can only appropriate as much property as their labor can use. Therefore, if a person can only use through his labor 1 acre of land, he cannot claim more than that. This is sometimes referred to as the labor restriction. Additionally, Locke contends that one can only appropriate what they can utilize without contaminating it. For instance, if someone gathers apples from a wild tree, since they contributed to the collection effort, those apples are their property. However, that person should only take as many apples as they can eat before they rot. The spoiling restriction is used to describe this. Lastly, Locke contends that one should leave enough resources for others to survive. You cannot take all the apples and leave nothing for the others. The sufficiency restriction is another name for this. Hence, these three prohibitions legally restrict the right to property. However, with the invention of money and development of a complex economic system, the limitations on acquisition on private property dwindle. The labor limitation is invalidated because, according to Locke, the labor of a servant belongs to their employer. One can purchase labor and use that labor to lawfully acquire huge sums of property. With the advent of money, the spoiling restriction was eliminated because property transformed into money does not deteriorate or get spoiled. The third restriction falls away with the argument of Locke based on labor productivity. He says that if land and labor are the two components necessary for agricultural output, then the contribution of land to that production is only 10%, while the contribution of labor is 90%. Therefore, by working to obtain property, one is just boosting the population of humans. Locke's explanation of how private property first appeared in the natural world thus serves as a defense for the stark income disparities that exist. The equality of the state of nature that Locke talks about is clearly the political equality only, and not the economic equality. In fact, one reason people eventually agree to participate into a social contract to defend their property rights is the growing accumulation of private property that results from money. Locke is aware that the creation of money and a monetary system causes an increase in the accumulation of wealth and the potential for greater inequality. Because it is based on consent and is ultimately still grounded in labor, Locke maintains that having a monetary system is still justified. Furthermore, Locke contends that a monetary system promotes efficiency and that, in contrast to prehistoric societies that relied on barter, societies with money developed more quickly, resulting in greater prosperity for all. So much so that he says the standard of living of a lowly laborer in a nation with a sophisticated monetary system is higher than that of a clan head in a primitive civilization. Locke's theory of property based on labor is ridden with many controversies, as it had implications that encouraged colonialism. His rejection of consent as a foundation for property, and particularly his argument that land that is not being actively cultivated or improved was unowned, gave Europeans the justification to colonize the lands inhabited by indigenous people. Just because of the fact that the practices of native indigenous people did not fit with the intensive individualistic understanding of labor and agriculture, he dismissed the historical customs of occupation and common use. This held true for both Native American subsistence practices and English concepts such as common grazing rights. Further, the rationale of mixing one's labor was used by colonizers to rationalize the displacement of native people and usurpation of their lands by claiming that their agricultural and industrial practices constituted mixing labor with that land. Thus, in conclusion, we can say that John Locke's expression of natural rights is one of his most significant ideas in itself and also for building the rest of his theory. His theory of natural rights forms a very significant intervention in the foundation of modern political thought. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed watching it. Thank you.